This session is, of course, raising the bar in Drupal, whiskey, Scotch, vodka, and rum. And it's not just a session, it's a drinking game. So I hope everyone brought their whiskey, Scotch, vodka, and or rum, because everyone should take a drink every time I say, during the presentation, I say the word. Who's got a, which one, what should we use?
Drupal.
I like someone, you can save that one for, save the for the party later. I think Drupal is the best one to use because it kind of unnerves me, both in sessions and even in daily development, the amount of times people use the word Drupal. By the way, the explanation doesn't count, then we go. And you go to these sessions and it's like Drupal, Drupal, like, oh, we get that. And it's like, a couple, and then when people are talking about developing, they always use the word Drupal. It's like, well, you're using it, you're immersed in it, like you're soaking in it now. But moreover, we don't want to, it's like Larry said, you don't tell Drupal anything. It's all Drupal, the whole system Drupal. But more importantly, the more we focus on Drupal, the more we're missing the whole point of getting off the island. The more we talk about that Drupal way, which used to be that kind of non-explanation for the way things work, when people either didn't actually have the knowledge of how they worked or just the patience to like tell you. So it was like, it's just the Drupal way, follow it. But this really is a non-explanation, and if we could purge our use of that and focus on the web stack, the web standards, and getting off the island, I think we'll be much better off. So having said that, every time I say the word Drupal for the rest of the session, you get to drink. We'll see how that goes. You may get a little bit hammered, I suppose, if you have real whiskey. And speaking of getting hammered, what I find really interesting about the version 8 is that it's built on, well, let's take, for example, in drinking. We've all had beer. Probably most of us in the room have had Scotch, right? And I kind of think of early versions of Drupal as being, that was a drink by the way, as being kind of beer-like in the sense, and of course you have all the ongoing debates between ale lovers and lagerheads, polling what's the best way to, whereas version 8 I think of much more as like a fine whiskey or something like that. And for me the point here is, when was the last time you were having a glass of beer or a glass of whiskey or Scotch, and you said, wow, this beer really tastes like Scotch, or wow, this Scotch reminds me of this beer. You don't, right? But they're both made of the exact same thing, right? It's malted barley, it's PHP. So we're taking the malted barley PHP and we're distilling it down so that it's much, much harder, and you're going to get drunk much, much faster. So raising the bar in Drupal is about raising the slope of an already daunting learning curve, right? Drupal already has this reputation for having this very high learning curve. Why is that? And why are we making it harder? Like that's the real question. But before we go any further, I just should probably at least introduce myself, or at least introduce my company. And I'm with a boutique engineering firm in New York called Elephant Ventures. Who are, it's a 10-year-old firm, it's exploded past 2 to 5 years, it's kind of grown as a very powerful technology firm with very senior engineers, and starting a Drupal practice as not just another tool in the box, but as an actual practice, as an approach to development, an approach to engineering best practices, and a way to leverage a platform which is powering 10% of the sites on the web. Which 10%? The top 10%, right? Because when we talk about 10%, we're talking about like every freaking domain registered, like everybody's flower pot or my Fluffy's pictures or something, right? But the space that we're targeting is the top 10%. It's the large enterprise companies, the daily brands that people interact with, and if you were at the keynote quite a while ago in San Francisco, there's a whole problem of playing to your base or losing your base, which was originally small and medium sites, or like reaching for the enterprise, and how to kind of make that decision. Do you try to retain both? Do you move into the enterprise for these large scale sites? And that is what's really raising that pain threshold, right? It's trying to make these inroads into the enterprise, so the smaller developers, the people that were able to quickly spin up a site for a nonprofit or a small business around the corner, it is both more daunting to do that, because we're making the platform much more powerful and able to power enterprise level applications, as as well as raising, there's like an economic thing there too, because as that skill becomes much more valued in the economy, and as Drupal developer rates go up, like those sites that have the medium-sized businesses and the nonprofits, they're having a crunch, right? They're finding it harder to find development talent they can afford. And that's an interesting problem that is not going to be addressed in this talk today. As far as assumptions, we'll just make some broad assumptions here. We're going to assume everyone's familiar with OSI layer 7 and MVC patterns, whether it's MVC or MVP, or you've kind of figured out that the C is actually a VP, and then it's like model view whatever. We're going to assume that everyone is very familiar with the GPL and its importance, as per Ryan's keynote today. We're going to make assumptions that, and all these assumptions, the whole point is they're going to break down for everyone, right? Like they're going to generally apply, but there's going to be exceptions. And we're going to make assumptions that people make assumptions that are often incorrect. Like, for example, I had 2 books to give away to you today based on a question which I'm going to ask. I only have 1 book now because someone walked by my table with my backpack, my laptop, and all my stuff and assumed the other book was just free swag. So I no longer have the Earl Miles book to give away. It was a giveaway, not a takeaway. And of course, probably a final assumption we'll make, which is not really an assumption so much as a given, is that Drupal Drink 8 will break the API in spectacular new ways. And where we've come from that we're moving and break the API? This is kind of like our story so far, right? This is where Drupal's been, right? I mean, is everyone kind of familiar with this kind of history? I'm not going to like walk you through the, it's a really, really interesting way. And who here is familiar with Contrib as a testing ground? Right, so we get the idea that we have certain core functionality, and then certain things either make it in or don't make it in, or we say they're going to make it in, like UI, and then that never makes it in, right? And like, oh, it's okay, Contrib will take care of that. And then the idea is, as the Contrib becomes adopted and perfected and utilized, then it can be pulled into core on the basis of its usefulness. And so 2004 was the year, I think that was the year that kernel trap flipped over. It was October of the year was when Linux journal flipped over to Drupal. In fact, it was on Halloween, I think, oddly enough, and they expected everything to go right on Halloween. Of course it didn't. But they actually had that up. They had it up and running within the day. I threw Mongo in here. We could probably talk about that over some beers later. And then coming up here, we now have Vodka, views in Drupal core, and Symfony 2, as well as rewriting, basically ripping out everything you knew in Drupal 7 is pretty much gone from Drupal 8. The point about is we often talk about scaling up, which is not really correct anyway. We're scaling up or down because you can't take a small kind of web development website program it's designed for powering medium businesses and scale it all the way up till it's able to in a performant manner power enterprise class sites, right? But you can take a platform that's been engineered to be able to be performant for high-end enterprise scalability, as well as having those usability features which the enterprise loves in content management, and scale it then, quote, down, to be able to use it in small sites. How do you do that? By raising the pain threshold on the individual developer, right? The developer that's not connected with like a high-end engineering firm in Europe that has a whole pool of senior talent, that all these people. So when you hire a firm like that, right, you have all of those engineers that can bring to bear on the problem. You have a highly concentrated kind of subset of the Drupal collaborative model. Remember, Drupal is probably, that's the drink, is probably the most successful model of open source collaboration in the world, right? It's where the Ubuntu project, should have gotten to, right? I mean, Ubuntu, think about it. They have their software, it's on everyone's desktop, it's right in front of you. How hard would it be to like integrate that right directly with your bug tracking system, with an issue system, with a testing system, right? Pushing out, you could even do, A/B testing, against all your desktop users, right? And you could each, they volunteer to join the testing program, they run the test, they submit the results, right? All of these things, but they didn't go there, right? They didn't end up in a place where they leveraged Ubuntu into being the most powerful open source collaborative platform in the world, which they should have. Instead what? They said, oh, hey, let's turn into an ad network. I mean, right? So, but it was up to our platform to kind of learn from those mistakes and learn from other mistakes in Linux while borrowing all the successes. Now, speaking of testing, let's get this book thing out of the way right away. I've got a book on testing to give away, and instead of waiting at the end, can anyone kind of tell me what are, at the high level, the two kinds of testing you want to do against, or you can do against your site or application?
Functional and unit.
That is. I think that's a book-worthy answer. It's one of the two answers I'm looking for, and I knew it's the one that everyone's going to come to.
White box, black box?
Not the one I'm looking for. Like two sides, like meaning that you can't think of a test that doesn't fall into one of these two categories. Like, for example, I can think of a test that's not unit or functional. You're kind of orthogonal, but.
UX?
So I'm going to give the book to the first person answered, if he can tell everyone what the difference between unit and functional is.
Well.
Okay, we'll save that one for afterwards and come get your book. The one I was looking for is conversion testing versus code testing. And the reason is because I saw these testing books we were going to give away, and I was thinking, oh, that's the most important thing, testing your code. And then I looked, and they're all conversion testing books, right? Which is very important, but probably not as important for us. So I'm going to skip over all the kind of things that I was going to kind of like touch on, the PHP requirements and the things, some of the API changes that are really kind of like grating, and kind of take a look at where Drupal's. Oh, I have absolutely no notes on this. Where Drupal is going in terms of not raising the learning curve for its targeting the enterprise, targeting those higher level applications, but its alignment with where the web is going, because it's not necessarily Drupal's just being dictated, by enterprise needs. Oh, big companies need this, so we're going to make Drupal like that. It's absolutely not the case at all, right? There is an understanding there of the evolution of the web and where the web is going in terms of REST-oriented services, in terms of systems integrations, in terms of mobile landscape, and kind of to know where the web is going, you have to get a sense of where it came from. And the web has its roots quite a long time ago. Who here is familiar with the Vannevar Bush story? As we may think. So in '45, Vannevar Bush, kind of semi-inspired by what happened in Hiroshima, I would describe like that whole display of kind of power and technological prowess. And in its most destructive form, was inspired to look at the information explosion, and that was the metaphor, the explosion that was happening at the time. It was one of the first moments where we saw that culturally, technologically, the massive amount of information we're producing was an explosion of that magnitude. And he got to thinking, well, how can we take this information explosion and turn it into a knowledge revolution? And make no mistake about it, we are at the kind of, not the end of that arc, but kind of like the tip of that acceleration, because we're at the stage in history where we have become, I don't know how to say this, the most efficient at producing information, or in the postmodern sense, simulating information, but creating massive amounts of storable digital data from the basic processes of the world itself, right? Everything from the flight trajectories of planes to data sensors to factories to where people are, what they're doing, what they're talking about. The amount of digital information that we are just creating and need to store and process somewhere is staggering. And having seen all this coming in '45, his story, as we may think, he envisioned the idea of a social memory to store all this, something he called Memex, that was referenced by Ted Nelson in '64 when he created the hyperlink, directly referencing the Vannevar Bush story, as we may think, which then Tim Berners-Lee in the '80s, when he creates the Inquire system as a social memory system, builds on Nelson's hyperlinks and names his Inquire after the Victorian book, which is supposed to be inquire within upon everything. Anything you ever need to know is in this book. Does that sound familiar, right? So then a few years later, he renames Inquire as the web, and here we are. So this information then, which is collected across data points, sensors, whether they're mobile, whether they're stationary, complete kind of map of absolutely everything that's going on in the world, and really everything that people are thinking. The visual representations of thought, the verbal representations of thought, all being recorded, this massive data set, which is growing too fast to ever be encompassed and processed by humans, right? So the future is then about the services layers where the machines can actually talk to each other and process information and maybe distill it down to the point where it will be useful to people on interfaces. And I kind of envision the interfaces of the future being much more choice-driven than content-driven. They're task-driven. That's why task lists are so popular. Managing people, managing actions. I just got back from China where the cabs are kind of run down, but they're technologically much more advanced than here. Like I got to when I landed at Orlando Airport, then I got in the cab. I had to tell my driver how to get here. Like had no turn by turn, right? We got lost, right? We had to go to the airport, so we finally got here. It was a stark contrast to being in China last week, where the car itself, the vehicle itself isn't as nice, but the turn by turn, they plot the address in, and then a voice just tells the driver where to turn, and he's literally just turning the wheel. Seems like he could probably be replaceable, but I suppose that's a question for Google. So to align with this massive direction the web is going, is Drupal made a very conscious decision then, and that was a drink. I'm doing pretty good on that one. For those of you who joined us late, yes, it's a drinking game. Every time you hear the word Drupal, you get to take a drink of whiskey, Scotch, vodka, rum. But it actually came out of, not necessarily the original kind of impetus for WSCCI, the Web Services and Context Core Initiative, which is now really just being referred to as Web Services, came out of the need for some kind of uniform context, right? And these were discussions that happened in 2009, and there was the Butler Project, and then at the Context Panels Hugfest in San Francisco, there was kind of where the basic request cycle was kind of discussed. The original spark that we need a context object, something that unifies all this context. Because how were we doing it before, right? You had all of these various objects that were being kind of pushed out to the page, and when the request came in, you had all these different places you had to try to pull stuff from, and it became this huge confusing mess, and we just needed a single context object. So then we looked at the Symphony Foundation object, and we created somewhere between 2010, 2011. It was the WSCCI charter. So the four basic goals here, are to centralize this request and context information, so that when a request comes in, you have all the information that you need to fill a request. To provide real, modern, robust web services built in that context information, and some kind of universal plugin system. And layout, using these tools to build up blocks everywhere. Now, I had that other book to give away by Earl Miles, and I've just given away the stupid answer to my question, because the question was going to be, who would you really consider to be the godfather of Drupal 8? Ryan?
Earl Miles?
Damn, are you a large or a medium?
No, I already stole your book. It's good.
Oh, you stole my book. That was awesome. That was quite awesome. So, but so many of his contributions are either going directly in, or they're just inspired what we are bringing. So it aims to transform Drupal from a first-class CMS to a REST server, right? So it's no longer just a method of serving pages, right? It is an actual REST server. Drupal, we're going to give us drinking or people get over John. Drupal becomes an actual REST server. So what is REST? Who here feels like they're comfortable with REST? They know what REST is, absolutely. REST is it's kind of, it comes after, it's an architectural style and a set of principles that were defined by Royal Fielding, who also was the co-author of the HTTP 1.0 spec. And it defines an architectural style where you look at everything as resources, you manage operations on representations of those resources, and kind of one of the key differentiators to what came before it is you're looking at resources, not functionality. It's very different than SOAP. It's very different than XML RPC, and it's very unstateful. And when you send off a request, it is not, I need you to do this operation, which creates all kinds of complex dependencies and does not create a system that can be easily managed through just a set of hyperlinks. But you're just looking for, I need that object. I need some representation of that object. Or to then operate on a representation of that object. So the basic principles of REST, if you follow the 6 principles and the 4 constraints, I believe I sometimes get which is a principle, which is a constraint. They don't seem to be semantically strong definitions, but it's client-server based. This means that there is a specific thing that's requested, a specific relationship between the client and the server, and you don't have to know anything else. When a client requests from a server a specific item, it doesn't need to know how that server is storing on the back end or what other services that server is putting together to assemble that object. It certainly doesn't need to know any of the infrastructure that server sits on or any of its other data points. It just has that singular relationship. It doesn't need to co-manage all of that information. It just needs this object. It's stateless, meaning that once that object is returned to the application, the server closes the connection, right? It doesn't remember anything. It doesn't even really recognize the client. On the server side, the server does not hold state, right? And of course, this creates all kinds of architectural problems as we evolve, through Comet and long polling and Ajax and trying to figure out ways around this, because our applications need to hold state somehow. There needs to be some global context, and the server can't hold it. It's layered, probably should go before cacheable, because what you want to do is you want to separate all of the layers of concern. You can't have a separation of concern without breaking things into layers. So you decouple them. So like links in a train, right? The thing has some flex to it. If all the layers are tightly coupled, then the whole thing moves as one, and you have all of these locked-in dependencies. And a good way to think about layers is that they're intermediaries between the request and the endpoint that are indistinguishable from the endpoint. The key here is you design so it cannot be a game of telephone. At each point, you have a controlled communication. The request does not change, so that if you're talking to any point in the layer, you're using a different level of language specificity, but you don't actually know, you could be actually talking to an endpoint. You don't know the difference except for the language specificity. And then by doing that, now you can start caching it at each of the layers, right? So that you don't have full round trips. At any layer in the stack, you could have the request being cached and it says, is this a cacheable request? Absolutely. You can return right now to increase your performance. Code on demand is a really, really interesting one for where applications are going now. Code on demand means that the server can then push out code to the client that the client then executes exactly as the server sends it. Does this sound familiar? And this, this kind of is great because as we see that our computational speeds are always going to be increasing faster than our network bandwidth, moving stuff going back and forth all the time becomes highly inefficient. But having everything in a single request, bringing it over, and then doing client-side operations, say using a front-end framework, passing an object, and we won't kind of get into like how these models are completely changing the way we architect applications, except to say that if we actually have these objects on the client side, and the client is able to then implement, against the business logic, and then just persist objects into a database, not having to mess with that whole query layer in between, right? Has anyone who here has already been playing with some frameworks such as Backbone and Angular? You're gonna get it. So the real unsolved problem here for me, though, the only really remaining problem is battery life on phones, right? Because as you push all these operations onto the client side, and the JavaScript, is going to start taxing phones. But probably one of the solutions there is that we're actually going to be moving away from phones. We're going to see the distribution. We're going to see tablets taking up a big part of that market. Now, I do want to correct one of the myths here about phones replacing the desktop, because currently they're not. Currently, while the mobile space is growing to dwarf the size of the desktop space, the desktop space isn't actually shrinking that much. People are still using their desktops. They're still at home on their computers. They're still using almost as much. It's just that now they have access to the web and to being connected all the time. anywhere they are, all the time. But for example, things like commerce, you find that people are doing the majority of their commerce, shopping and buying things on the computers. People don't buy a lot of things on the phone. Now the tablet, again, will probably solve that problem. The tablet's going to come in and it's probably going to be the media where people are doing most of their buying, right? Because computers are these crazy, bulky, clunky things with all these parts that you have to have on a desktop, whereas a tablet is this really nice thing that has enough of a size, sort of form factor that it's comfortable, kind of commerce experience, whereas the phone really isn't. And then finally, uniform interface is a really important REST principle and is one that we use all the time in open source. And the uniform interface is really giving a target that everyone can work to. And it's actually it's a less efficient way to develop. Who here kind of already gets like why the uniform interface makes development less efficient? Right, because we have a couple people that actually get the idea that your problem spaces, your problem domains, actually tend to have structures that are way more divergent than we think of them already using these collaborative tools and these common platforms. And the most efficient way to develop applications, as we've done historically, is to develop your data structures directly based on your problem domain. And they're going to be very divergent from other domains that you may want to connect with, interact with, and have service requests against. So what we do, though, is we create a uniform interface across all of these domains that gives everyone a target to shoot for. And by using a uniform interface instead of data structures that directly model your domain, it's less efficient. It's absolutely less efficient to look up. But what happens? You leverage those, or really you give up some local efficiencies for collaborative productivity. So now the overall system has these emergent properties, and it enables us to accelerate our collaborative development over our local efficiencies. Now, layered on top of the principles of REST are some constraints. And the first constraint is probably the most abstract one, and it's the constraint of resource identification. And this essentially means that you are defining at some level, this is the initial step of any coherent and meaningful concept you define as a resource. And we define it and we just leave it at that. Because the inventor of the web himself has analogized resources to the Platonic ideal, and it gets very abstract and very deep fast. But the point here is for development is really a URI is going to point to a single resource. By building Drupal as a REST server, then we look to request representations of those those resources, and all the operations are done on the resource. So when we identify a resource at the end of a URI, then we're going to request it, and we're going to tell the server that we want a representation based on what?
Some media types?
Based on media types, based on what you accept, and what the HTTP method is going to be, are kind of like the two top ones. And you have secure versus insecure. You have protocols in there too, which representation. But the key one is found in the accept headers, and the accept headers are what's really required for mobile, right? So you need to be able to, every single device out there needs to be able to specify in the accept headers what's an acceptable representation for it. And so this was a realization that happened early on. That's what was needed. And so rather than the Drupal team building it internally, what happened? Well, we realized that the Symfony framework has been rebuilding Symfony 2 for 6 years, building an ACP server. And if we need those accept headers baked in at a deep level to accelerate support for mobile services, why not use the framework that's actually built those at the framework level, spent 6 years solving this problem. So what do we get from that? We get the increased robustness, right? So sure, we could have built that ourselves, right? But it probably would have been, a Drupal-y solution, if you know what I mean. And what I mean is technical debt, right? And it turns out that using the Symfony framework has paid off a lot of technical debt that it acquired through that Our Story So Far slide. We went through all those years. All that stuff that went in, it still went in a way that here's a piece that talks to another piece in a disjoint manner. It does not use really a common framework. The framework is this giant global language space that everyone has to master in the learning curve. So when we talk about raising the learning curve, it's actually probably won't raise it as much. So, so then self-descriptive messaging just means you don't need anything additional. Everything is contained in the message. And then hypermedia is the engine of application state. This just means, and when I say just means, you often hear that people, oh, hypermedia is just, it's the engine of the application state. But this just means where is the state held? The server doesn't hold state, right? The hypermedia is what drives the state, so that every link you click on should have all the information to all that state. So building the new platform, RESTful calls are seen as the most important handling of a RESTful request. But why is this? Why do we follow all these constraints and principles? Do we do it just because Roy Fielding was a really smart guy and he said, oh, this is a really good way to do things, and he was really academic? Or do we do it because following these principles not only gives us that those collaborative advantages, but by following those principles of layering, of cacheability, of statelessness, we allow emergent properties to emerge in the system, which include performance, which includes scalability, which include like a simplicity of design, which brings that learning threshold back down, allows people to leverage a powerful underlying framework with less effort. That's why REST is so important. Not just because it is the way. Again, it's away from that. It's not the hand-wavy Drupal way of doing things. It is by following these principles, we build systems that are more performant, that are more scalable. So now we have REST support for non-content entities as well as I believe we have REST support for config entities too. And don't quote me on that. I'll have to confirm that. If you want to export your view as a REST entity using the REST module, which is Drupal 8, then it's as simple as enabling a REST display for that view, provided that it is a content entity, not a configuration entity. So what's the single most important thing that you, as say a module developer, can do to make this transition to 8? What's the single most important thing?
Change. Don't be set in your way.
So stop. So it's one of the things that's obvious when you think about it. You stop thinking in terms of pages. Stop thinking in terms of returning pages. Stop thinking in terms of applications being designed in pages, and start thinking purely in terms of a request and a response. You send a request to a REST server. You find what are the acceptable responses, and you return it. I mean, for one thing, pages are going away. I mean, everything seems to be converging on single-page applications, right? With a series of XML RESTful calls and GET requests. That's probably the most. So what's the primary change in request handling? So from previous versions to the new version, what's the primary change in how that request was handled? Is it now that previously it was what? A path? What did you have? How did you request something before? Up to now, it was a path, right? And now the primary change is it's not against paths, right? It is the request itself contains a path, but it also contains a method. It contains accept. It's all this. So to accomplish all this, Drupal Drink is now built on the Symfony framework, which really explodes the code base. T-shirt for anyone that can guess within, I don't know, just how many lines of code are in Drupal 8?
16,000.
More than there were CSS in P5.
Exactly. Okay, what size? That's good. That's just
large.
Large.
Thank you.
450,000.
Okay, it's about half that. But that was that you?
Yeah, but I don't.
Yeah. So
She's just tweeting numbers out like a couple days ago.
I think if you actually
Take out white space and comments.
Exactly. I think it's actually with white space and comments, it is close to half, 8 million lines. Right? And the hooks have gone from like 40 hooks and back in a system where everyone knew hooks, right? You knew all the hooks in the system, to a system where I don't know there's a hook for that. I'm sure there's a hook. Then you look and you find the API. Oh, that's right. There's a hook for that. So we've gone from 40 hooks. Then we hit 180. We kept going. I'm pretty sure the goal is for Drupal 8 to have one hook for every developer at Aquia. I think those numbers are actually converging. So building on the Symphony system, does anyone know why? And kind of in light of Ryan's amazing keynote, we should probably reference why was the reason we picked Symphony? Because we've talked about a powerful framework, a powerful collaboration, getting off the island, aligning ourselves with the restful direction of the web, single page apps, client-side frameworks. But what does anyone actually remember the actual real reason that what was like? Okay, why we? So we looked at what did we look at? We looked at Zen framework, which is a glue framework, right? Like Code-Igniter, and then Symphony framework, which is conceived, still people think of it as a full stack framework like Cake, right? So does everyone gets the differences between like full stack and glue frameworks? Like a glue framework gives you a number of different modules and libraries that then you can leverage in your own application. You can just kind of pick and choose like a buffet style. And a full stack framework is, well, if you want data primitives, then you need our session handling, and then you need our response contextualization, you need all these things. Full stack framework, you're supposed to use the whole thing, right? And Symphony 1 was absolutely a full stack framework, right? Symphony 2, now it's kind of like a whole range. Symphony 2 is like 23 components, and then a full stack framework built on top of that, and then there's Symphony CMF, but you can actually grab some of these. So we started looking at them, and it was Dixon and Squash spent that summer comparing the two and kind of getting an assessment. But what was the reason then that it came back? It was the CLA, it was Zen CLA, right? It was all about the licensing, just like Ryan was talking about this morning. The Zen framework would have required everyone that contributed to Drupal to have signed a CLA that goes back to Zen, and so it was just a non-starter. And then so maybe we didn't get some of the additional performance from the Zen framework that's now in PHP 5.5, right? So now Zen Optimizer replaces APC. APC is still there if you need it, if you want to rely on it, but you get like a 10% bump in 5.5 just for switching over to Zen Optimizer. But make no mistake about it, the Symphony framework is very performant, and so we originally looked at it just for that context object. And then the first thing that went in though was PSR, right? Was the namespacing. So who here feels like who here gets what PSR is and how we're doing it? So PSR creates a global namespace, for PHP applications that's not just for your application and for your framework, but it's supposed to be for the PHP space itself, right? So that you can then start making things more modular. You can start moving libraries between applications and frameworks. And of course, we won't get into the whole controversy of how it was pushed through, and people that are upset that there's this new standard that they have to follow for namespacing their applications. As I mentioned this weekend to someone, some developers are just too lazy to support lazy loading, right? They're just they want everything in one way, and they probably want it in a huge, big monolithic file, right? Which isn't going to work for, right? You do not want to have to parse that huge file to find all your classes. Now, just like the code base in Drupal Drink has exploded, so the number of files have gone up, right? So this stuff is not all crammed into a single file. Every file follows a namespace, and that's where you find the class, and that's where you can lazy load. And that's one of the approaches to solving the problem of alter-itis, which is when that request comes in, when you're answering that request, and when you're returning the response object, you don't know all the stuff that's going to come along and do something to it. That's what we call the problem of alter-itis. And so you can do things which are really screwy, right? And by having a lazy loading system, by having pre-knowledge, you can kind of introspect, or actually it uses reflection to find everything that is going to be loaded. Now, there's actually, I shouldn't mention reflection because there's actually a way to alter crap without, and kind of do an end run around it, but that's not really something. So a foundation then takes basically the PHP globals, right, and wraps them in a request object, which then we hand off to the kernel, and then the kernel is what's going to fire up your routing, control your routing system, which is going to look at your route collection using a matcher dumper generator system, which I think we can. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. But menu execute active handler goes away, as does the default content type, right? That all goes away, and then that actually ends up getting split off into Scotch. So in February 2012, I didn't even note, on the slide that had a whiskey glass. I intentionally made the whiskey glass really big, right? Because whiskey was so big that in February 12, we had to kind of rein in, whoa, this project that started out as a context object, we just need a little context, has turned into rewriting Drupal. That's what happened, right? I mean, people followed that. It's like somebody got their foot in the door, hey, we need a context object. It's really important, right? And then it's like the salesman in the door, and then the door opens up, and the door opens up, and the next thing, wait, did we just rewrite? Yeah, we did, and ripped out all code and replaced with Symfony. So let's see where we want to go. I don't want to bust into all the Symfony stuff right now, but in PHP the request, you've got the global berries, you've got your get post session, and so the foundation replaces the globals, and you have basically you make it what? You create an object. I mean, that's the whole key there, right? Is you're creating an object that can be passed around in an object-oriented fashion. Trying to get the slide won't change. Hold on, 1 second here. Okay, Houston. Okay, well, we'll just stay on this slide for the rest of the. It's a pretty good slide, right?
It has a lot of topics.
It's got a lot of topics, right?
Should we just throw a dart?
Yeah, let me just, oh, yeah. That's completely,
Frozen.
yeah. Oh, my time's not up, is it? Because, oh, well, that's, okay, so it's much smarter than I am. So, well, this is probably a perfect point. After this slide, I did have a diagram of the actual routing system with currently that has a legacy chain matcher, but eventually not only does hook menu go away, but the hook route info goes away, and everything becomes uses the Symfony system, so that you then have to create your routes where instead of hook menu you use a YAML file, right? So then you define a route, and a route has a name, which is different than a path. So then and inside of that you have a controller, and you have a default path. So the route name, and sorry, I don't have slides on this, the thing's locked up, but we'll jump into questions right away. So route name matches a path, and then it hands off to what? A controller. Without some notes, it's difficult to get into the granularity of it, but that all goes in your YAML file to define a route. Now, if you are actually returning a page, then it's going to fire up the Scotch system, right? Because that controller can return what? What can your underscore controller return? Fully rendered twig template, right? Can return the full deal, which in Drupal parlance is currently a layout, which is a plugin, of course. And the layout plugin contains what? It contains another YAML file. It contains the HTML twig, and it contains any assets. And that's really all you need for a Drupal layout to correspond to a twig template. And the language is weirdly in flux, and it doesn't align with the SMAX language, and the Drupal language and the twig language are all kind of, so you still have to kind of figure out what a lot of these terms mean. But layouts are much more powerful than that. I mean, that's just the minimum that you need for a Drupal layout. But you can do much, much more with that. So then you have a display, and displays are then decoupled from layouts and themes. And the display is what? It's the pairing of the regions to the layout, right? So then inside of that you have a display which takes your layouts, which are decoupled from the themes, and then you can define multiple layouts per theme, right? So, and all of this is designed to both serve that text HTML response when you actually do on a page and you're using the Scotch or the blocks everywhere system, where everything becomes a block, right? I mean, what's wrong with the block system, right? I mean, what's wrong with it? Thank you, that's the answer. Josh has got the answer right here. Yeah, what's not wrong with the block system? Is anyone who here, sure, I'll tell you what, an 8 gig USB key for anyone that knows when the block system went in. Give me shirt and a USB key.
Drupal 4.
Yeah, it was actually it was before that, it was 2000. Who said that, and what's your size?
Oh, I already got yours.
Oh,
Extra large.
Extra large, there you go. block system went in 2000. 2000. It's a 13-year-old block system we're replacing. So, and it's really dumb. It's so
ready.
Biggest problem is it gets built on every single page, whether you need it or not.
exactly right. I mean, everyone gets that right. That you render all the blocks whether they're visible or not. I mean, that's just one of the myriad problems. So now everything actually is a block, right? The logo's a block. You know, any of all this. Can't even think of them offhand. But like absolutely everything on the page is a block, and everything. All of those blocks are RESTful resources. They can all be requested independently. You can determine through ESI which can be cached and which can't be cached to make the system highly performant. So with a completely frozen MacBook here, I think we should probably turn to questions because there's probably a better way of kind of like steering how I want to cover these things. Right back there.
Do you think Drupal will eventually move to the one-page site design?
Well, it's prepared to do that right now. That's the whole thing. Do you mean does the framework support single site page designs?
I mean by default.
I mean single page site designs, yeah.
Right. Do you think that they will move exclusively to that instead of putting pages out on the request?
That's one of those questions that's like would that happen in Drupal 9? Is there enough impetus for it? I think probably not. Just based on the fact that there's so much UI involved there. But then, on the other hand, I wouldn't have predicted that the unified blocks and layouts whole thing would just go in, right? So bring together Scotch, Whiskey, Field UI, Spark, using there's you can just define when you have your plugins, and I actually have some slides I was going to go over dependency injection and kind of like the whole like what plugins are and how they work using dependency injection. But we can talk about that later if you like. But within a plugin, your plugin annotation, which lives where? Plugin annotations live where?
In the YAML file.
Ah, take your shirt.
Yes.
You get a shirt just for guessing, but you were wrong.
Doc block?
Thank you. Size?
Medium.
Medium? I can't tell without this dark.
Sorry, man.
But I don't need that. I'll take one.
No. You can't answer all the questions, Brian. Yes. So the annotations go in the doc block, and the annotations really it's you have a title. I think there's a type. There's module, of course, and then there's the edit annotation. And if you set editor to direct, then what? Then it knows that it can use the Create.js system, and you can edit in place using Create.js, which is the reason that Backbone went in. And so Backbone is now in there. I don't know, and this is really kind of directly to your question, I don't know that Backbone is actually in Drupal 8 in a way that is going to enable us to easily use it on the front end to make any kind of application. It seems to be very specifically designed to support the Spark and the edit module using Create.js. In fact, my development work is steering more towards Angular. It's a framework that I'm much more impressed with than Backbone. And why not use that one too? Let's put them all in there. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Please, I hope no one takes that serious. Other questions? Yeah.
How painful do you think it will be to migrate an existing T7 website to T8?
It's surprisingly less painful than you would, probably assume. But then that kind of begs the whole question of whether you want to upgrade a site at all, or whether we didn't kind of settle the question of upgrades versus migrations. I would love to see a lot more kind of empirical data about, and it's kind of a hard thing to quantify, about really what is your resource time for upgrading sites, and what amount of time do people just to spend to rebuild the functionality in 8 and suck all the content in. And I think that's a much more viable path. And I think with the new Twig templating system and with all of the changes, it's probably the smarter thing to do. It's a kind of a qualified yes, right? Any other questions? I hear some rustling. I think we must be running out.
We can see the food.
I'm standing between you and lunch. Okay, let's take all the questions to lunch.
Thanks,